So with that in mind, we're going to talk about the story of Daniel chapter 3. And to understand Daniel chapter 3, you have to know what happened in Daniel chapter 2, which we talked about last week. This was the story of the prophet Daniel and the king Nebuchadnezzar. And the king had a dream in which there was a statue. And in this dream, a giant rock came along and crushed this statue into tiny bits and then blew away those bits into tiny little pieces, and the wind blew them away like chaff into the wind. Now, the rock that was there that crushed the statue eventually grew into a mountain that covered the whole earth, and that was the end of the dream. Daniel told the Nebuchadnezzar, the king, he told him, hey, I want you to know what this dream means. It means that your kingdom will be temporary. This statue was made of different materials. Yours was at the top, the head, it was gold, and it will be replaced by an inferior kingdom. We just want you to know that as you govern over this empire of Babylon, because what this dream means is what the thesis of the book of Daniel is, which is empires will come and go, but God will remain forever. And the king responds to this interpretation that his kingdom will be ephemeral or temporary by saying, oh, Daniel, you clearly are a prophet of God. I am so grateful that you are here. You will be promoted, and I will recognize your God for the rest of my life. And you sit there and you think to yourself, wow, this is such a wonderful story. Here's a king, a politician who actually had a change of heart. This is incredible. And then you read chapter 3, verse 1, in which King Nebuchadnezzar says, you know what? I'm going to build a statue. Just like the statue I saw in my dream, and instead of having just part of her be gold, I'm going to cover this thing head to toe in the material of gold to signify that Babylon will in fact live forever. That it will be an eternal kingdom. And this idea that empires will come and go, but God will remain forever is wrong, because Babylon is awesome. So the king Nebuchadnezzar builds this 90-foot high statue in the middle of a plain, and he says to himself, all right, now that this statue's built, I want to see who is swearing their allegiance to the empire. I'm going to have a band play, and I'm going to release an edict to all the people. And so this edict went out to all the people, and it said, hey, whenever you hear the royal band play, we want you to know that you have to turn toward the statue and bow down low in reverence toward the statue. And we really want you to do this, so much so that we're going to require it by law. And whoever does not fall down and worship this golden statue that I built in the plains shall immediately be thrown into a burning, blazing fire. And this is the law that went out. And once the king was certain that everybody had heard it, the king turned to the royal band and said, strike up the band, boys. Let's hear this music loud and proud. So the music began to play, and the king watched over the plain as to who was bowing and who was not. And the king was very pleased because he saw every person bow before the statue, except for 3 people. And he looked at those 3 people and he thought to himself, you know what? I'll bet they don't hear it. And he turned to the band, he said, play it louder. Let's get this music going. So the band played as loud as they could, but those 3 figures refused to bow down. The king then sent the guard after those 3 figures. They were brought before the king. He said, what are your names? They said, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And the king said, why did you disobey me? And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego respond with one of the great lines of scripture. They say, oh, Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to present a defense to you in this matter. Now, the king does not like being told that he's not even worthy of a response. So he becomes enraged. So enraged that the author of Daniel says that his face became distorted. Now, he becomes so angry that he turns to the person who's in charge of the furnace and says, heat it up 7 times higher than it normally is. To which the furnace person must have said, like, how is that even possible? Okay, I'll just turn it up full blast. So he says that. He says to the guards, he says, guards, go, take these 3 men, throw them into the furnace. And the way that Daniel tells the story is that they then approach the furnace, and the furnace is so hot that the guards die of heat exhaustion on the way to the furnace, which implies that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego looked at the guards and said, well, we'll just keep walking into this furnace. So they walk into the furnace, and the king assumes he's about to hear some very gruesome screams that will serve as a warning to the rest of the people. But all he can hear is the roaring fire. So the king looks into the fire, saying to himself, surely they're dead, and it was just too hot and they died in an instant. But then he turns to his aide and he says to him, was it not 3 men that we threw bound into the fire? Because I'm looking into this fire now, and I see 4 people in the fire, and the 4th has the appearance of a god. The aide says to the king, yes, you put only 3 people in there. The king then says, bring them out. He screams to the people inside the fire, servants of the Most High God, come out. And as those 4 figures approach the threshold, only 3 cross back into the not so hot world and then approach the king. The king says, clearly, you are servants of the Most High God. Therefore, I will make a second edict or a second decree. The decree goes like this: any people, nation, or language that utters blasphemy against the God of these citizens shall be torn limb from limb and their houses laid in ruins, for there is no other God who is able to deliver in this way. And that is the end of the story of the fiery furnace. Now, I have to tell you that when I tell you this story this morning, there are 2 things that are true for me about this story. The first is I want you to know I appreciate this story, and I find value in this story. And the second thing that is also true is that this story does not sit well with me. So let's talk first about why I appreciate this story. If you look closely at the historical context of this story, you have to go back to 2,600 years ago, to the 6th century BCE, when there is the tiny little nation of Judah with the capital Jerusalem here, and the empire of Babylon. In 586 BCE, Babylon got mad at the people of Judah. They attacked Judah, they leveled Judah, and they took all the survivors from Judah back across the desert to live in Babylon in what a period that we refer to as the Babylonian exile. Now, this is the setting of the book of Daniel. It all unfolds in this window between 586 and 539 BCE. However, the scholars that I trust do not believe that this is when the book of Daniel was written. For that, you have to go 400 years after the exile, after the people who lived in Judah survived not only the Babylonian Empire, but the Persian Empire and the Greek Empire. And all of a sudden, you have this tiny little nation who has lived in the shadow of these 3 empires still surviving, and they have something to say in the 2nd century BCE. Now, the scholars that I trust, they write about how Daniel was probably written sometime between 250 to 165 BCE. And when you think about it from this context, there is this religious minority who has to deal with these massive empires, and they're trying to figure out how to live when their religion is not the dominant religion of the empires they've lived in. So the idea that they come up with and what they're trying to share with this story is devotion to your faith is the greatest way to change those who are in power. And I have to tell you, I appreciate that when I look at this story in this context. But this lesson and this idea doesn't really work when we read it in Redlands in California in 2022. You know why? Almost every politician is a Christian. So it's not like I'm going to be living my life of faith and all of a sudden one of our local politicians is going to be like, Christianity, tell me a little bit about that. That's interesting. And this idea, while it's valuable in its context that it was originally written in, doesn't quite work the same in our era today, does it? Which brings me to the second thing that is true about this story. This story does not sit well with me. Because here you have a king who, after having an encounter with God, remember, he sees God in the story, his response is not to renounce his furnace-burning ways. Instead, he makes a decree that says, any people, nation, or language that utters blasphemy against the God of these citizens shall be torn limb from limb. So the king doesn't say, well, I've been a tyrant. The king says, oh, I've just been a tyrant to the wrong people. I will be a tyrant to those people, and then we've now on the right team so that this tyrannical act is now justified by God. So the king has this encounter with God, and the furnace stays in place, right? And the religious persecution just shifts to a different group of people. So this story does not sit well with me because this is a story about conversion without transformation. And it's important for Christians to make the distinction between these two. Conversion, whether you want to call it turning to the faith or being baptized, is important, particularly for a sense of belonging. But it's not the end goal, is it? Transformation is the end goal. And conversion without transformation is worthless. You may ask how I know this. It's because I've had the honor and privilege of being part of this church for over 6 years now. And I have been asked before by a few people, what is the highest compliment anyone could pay your church? And it doesn't take me long to think about because I know that transformation is what matters in this church and in a walk of faith. The highest compliment anyone could give this church is that they attend or they participate online or they interact with some of the things that we create, and they tell other people, Paradox Church helped me to become a more loving person. This is transformation. And if somebody says, you know what, I went to church and I found that I was more loving of myself, more loving of my family, more loving of people who are my friends, who are not my friends, more loving of my enemies even. I went to church and I found that I loved the earth more. I loved God more, whatever that means to me. I loved all of these things more. I found myself being more patient and kind and compassionate, and that's why I go back to church. Well, then at that point, we have represented what church should be, right? And transformation is much more important to us than conversion, even though conversion matters to us, and we want everyone here to feel like that they can belong if they want to. So when you consider these two truths, that this was written to a specific audience, and that it also is a story about conversion without transformation, a question I want to ask you this morning is this. What if we retold this story? Refocusing on our current context in Redlands, California in 2022, and also prioritizing transformation over conversion. Because I think that if the author of Daniel was alive with us today, I think they'd tell the story differently. Now, this retelling the story is not meant to replace the writings of Daniel. It's not meant to be better than the writings of Daniel. It's meant to be written in a way, and meant to be told in a way that speaks more to our current context and prioritizes transformation. So with that in mind, I'd like to retell the story of the fiery furnace in a way that makes sense for our day and age. And it begins like this. Once upon a time, there was a president. And this president was recently elected because he ran a fiery and angry campaign. This president told the world and told his country that Christians were to blame for everything. He said, look at the history of the world. Christians have been responsible for genocide and abuse and judgment and excluding others. If we get rid of Christianity in our country, then we'll have a better country. The issues are very obvious to me. And so people heard this on the campaign trail and they applauded, they cheered, they chanted, they shouted, and they overwhelmingly elected this president into the Oval Office. And when the president got to the Oval Office, there was the first day and then there was the second day. And on day 2, the president signed an executive order outlawing Christianity. But not just outlawing Christianity, making it so that anyone who practiced Christianity would be put to death by way of a fiery furnace. So the president said, listen everyone, this is now in effect on a Wednesday. I know this weekend's coming up. I don't want anyone practicing Christianity. So as the weekend arrived, people held their breath as they waited to see who would show up to church that weekend. And wouldn't you know it, all of the churches in the country were empty that weekend, except for one. Because there were 3 women named Shayna, Mina, and Abigail who went to church that weekend, and they professed their belief in the risen Christ. Well, as you can imagine, if every church in the country is empty except for one, it caught the attention of first local news and then national news, and it wasn't long before the president himself heard about this. The president was very upset, so upset that he said, arrest those women and bring them here. So he sent the National Guard, or whoever it is the president sends to go arrest people, and he said, bring them back. They go and they get Shayna, Mina, and Abigail. They put them on a military plane. They bring them back to the president's office, and the president looks at them and says, don't you understand? We're trying to unify the country. Everybody's on board with this except for you three. Why would you cause this much trouble and refuse to comply with that which is meant to unify?" And Shayna, Mina, and Abigail stared at the most powerful person in the country and responded with these words: "Mr. President, we have no need to present a defense to you in this matter." Now, the president didn't like that. The president was very upset. So he turned to his aide and he said, "Fire up the fiery furnace. Not only that, but call the news crews. We're going to nationally televise their execution to send a word out to everyone that Christianity will not be tolerated." And so the news crews came out, they fired up the fiery furnace, and the president was there with Shayna, Abigail, and Mina. And he said to them, "It is now time." And the three women said, "We'll walk ourselves, thank you very much, into this furnace." And the three women boldly and courageously walked toward the furnace. And the president braced for impact. He had a sense that there would be some screams of agony coming from the fire, but they walked in without a sound. In fact, no sound was made at all. The president thought that something must have been wrong, so he looked in closely, and he turned to his aide and said, "Didn't we put 3 women in the fire? Because I now see a 4th woman, and she has the appearance of a god." And the aide said, "You definitely put 3 in there, Mr. President." And he said, "Turn the furnace off." And they turned the furnace off, and he said, "Come on out, Shayna, Mina, Abigail, come back out, come talk to me." And while 4 women approached the threshold, only 3 exited the furnace. And the president looked at these 3 women and made eye contact with each of them, and all of a sudden something changed inside of him. His heart opened up wide, and he realized what he had done. He looked at these 3 women, and he asked himself the question, "What have I done to you?" Because while he had blamed Christians for anger and power and genocide and unjust death, he realized that he had become part of that system, and he had become everything that he had despised in his life. So he looked at each of them and he said to them one by one, "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." He then went back to his office, signed an executive order that made religious intolerance something that the nation would not tolerate. And then he said to his people around him, "We got to get rid of furnaces in our nation." And he signed an executive order getting rid of all fiery furnaces. And then he said to his aide, "I am now stepping down to resign because I don't think I can be trusted with this kind of power." Now, not everybody knows what happens next, but he definitely disappeared from the public eye. And some say that he went to a local community and continually served those who were in need. Now, this is not the end of the story. 1 year after the fiery furnace, the national consciousness had changed. There was an awareness that this fiery furnace was wrong. So there was a national holiday where Mina, Abigail, Shayna came out in public. They waved. They said, "We overcame the flames." And there was all this pride as people said, "We did it." This was a step forward in the right direction. And they planned another anniversary celebration the year after that, and the year after that. And then 10 years after the fiery furnace, the government said, "Let's pull out all the stops." Biggest budget imaginable, the decade remembrance of this fiery furnace. They pulled off an elaborate party, but it was underattended. They didn't hit the attendance marks they expected because interest in this topic had begun to wane. Not only that, but the people who were there 10 years after the fiery furnace didn't seem quite as enthusiastic about what happened 10 years ago as the people who had just lived through it. As years went by, 30 years after the fiery furnace, some tragedies started to strike. The first was that Shayna and Abigail suddenly passed away, leaving Mina as the sole survivor. Not only that, but there was a strong online movement where people had looked extensively at the footage and started web pages talking about how all of the footage of the fiery furnace was faked, how none of it was real. And they could prove by saying, "Look at the way this flame bends this way and look at the way the flame bends that way. It's all a hoax. It didn't actually happen." And so Mina, the sole survivor, was asked constantly by reporters, "Hey, did the fiery furnace actually happen? Did it literally and historically occur?" And while Mina patiently answered those questions one by one, after years of hearing this question, she finally said, "Enough." And Mina disappeared from the public eye. Nobody really knew what happened to her next. 30 years after her disappearance, 60 years after the fiery furnace, Christianity was no longer a minority religion in the country. Christianity exploded, and the majority of people in the country are now identified as Christian. With that majority, all of a sudden came the election of Christian representatives. And when you mix Christianity and politics, what happens? Well, an interesting idea of Christianity comes forward, doesn't it? The idea that Christians will now stand up and say, there is only one true religion, and it's mine. There is only one morally superior religion, and it's mine. Vote for me, and I will govern with Christian ethics. And this started at the local level, and then at the national level, and it kept gaining momentum until 80 years after the fiery furnace, Christians all of a sudden found themselves in charge for the first time in the nation's history, in charge of the executive, the legislative, and the judicial branches of government. The Christians in charge looked at each other and said, this is the moment God has been preparing us for. We have to make God's name known to the entire country. And they went to the president, this new president, 80 years after the fiery furnace, and they signed into law this whole new way of being. They said, we are going to outlaw every religion except Christianity. Every religion is immoral compared to Christianity, so we will only tolerate that which is moral. And anyone who doesn't believe in Christianity, who doesn't practice Christianity, will be thrown into a fiery furnace. Now it's here that you may interject in my story and say, wait, Craig, Christians would never do this. They would never say, believe in God or burn forever. To which I would say, oh, yes, they would. They're just speeding up the process at this point. Now, this was greatly disturbing to people outside of the Christian faith. In particular, there was a young woman who we will call the historian. Now, this historian had recently graduated from her master's program, and her master's thesis was on political events that happened 80 years before her lifetime. And as she was going through this master's thesis, she knew the story of the fiery furnace inside and out. She had heard all the people saying it was a hoax and it was online. She personally believed that it was a real story, but she thought it had been exaggerated a little bit. I mean, because, people in a furnace, come on. And so the historian was greatly troubled by this because she didn't identify herself as Christian. And so she said, what can we do with this abuse of power that we are seeing in our lifetime today? And so she said to herself, you know what? People lost track of Mina about 30 years ago, 60 years ago, somewhere in there. They started to lose track of her. I wonder what happened to her for the rest of her life. And so the historian set out on a quest trying to figure out what happened to Mina. And she heard about things that Mina did later in her life. She grew a garden. She got involved in a local community. And then she was talking to a neighbor who used to live next to Mina, and he said, I have Mina's address. Do you want to just go talk to her yourself? And the historian said to this local, Mina's still alive? And the local said, yeah, of course. And the historian said, well, she'd have to be 100 years old by now. And the local said, well, yeah, she lived a long time. And so she gave the historian the address, and the historian then went to the address and thought to herself, wow, this has got to be a scam. I will probably get mugged as soon as I open this door. And so the historian knocks on the door of what is supposed to be Mina's address, and no one answers. The historian knocks one more time, and no one answers. The historian says, okay, it's a joke. I give up. And turns to leave, and then all of a sudden she hears the door creak open. And because the historian has seen all kinds of pictures of Mina, because this is what she has studied, she instantly recognized a 100-year-old version of Mina. The historian's jaw dropped. She said, is it really you? And Mina said, of course it is. Who else would it be? Mina then invited the historian for tea, and they had a little bit of small conversation, and then Mina said, you've come a long ways to find me. What can I help you with? And the historian said, well, Mina, the first question I have for you is, did the fiery furnace really happen? Is it really true? At that moment, the historian watched as the twinkle in Mina's eyes quickly faded. And the historian realized that she had asked the most annoying, low-level question imaginable in response to the fiery furnace. Mina said, "There are so many other questions that are worth asking about this story. Why did you start with that one?" The historian said, "I don't know. Let me try again." "Mina, I have to tell you," she continued, "that there is a lot of fear in our country right now. There's a lot of anxiety, there's a lot of uncertainty. There is this government that's been overrun by Christians. I know you identify as Christian, but it's scaring us that aren't Christians. And you're the person, kind of the figure of someone who stood up to the government when you were persecuted. How is it that we're supposed to act this way? Because the government's going backwards. The government isn't helping us anymore. You understand how hard this is?" And Mina just smiled at her. The twinkle returned and she said, "Oh, child, did you really think the point of that story was that you could find your own salvation in the government?" And the historian stopped there and said, "Well, it's a problem when the laws go backwards and sometimes they go forwards, and why don't we just stick to forwards?" And Mina said, "I know. Let me tell you what I've seen in my lifetime. Good politicians come, good politicians go. Bad politicians come, and bad politicians go. But you know what doesn't go like that? The work of God." And the historian looked at her. And the historian didn't really believe all of that, but at the same time, it's almost like this elderly, wise woman was saying to her, "Hey, don't think that this is a linear path forward. This is a difficult road, and sometimes it goes forward, sometimes it goes backward, but there is something constant that remains through all of it." So the historian said, "I guess I just have one more question. You said that that's not what the story is about. You said that the story isn't about us finding salvation in the government. So can I ask you then, Mina, what is the story about?" And Mina looked at her with a smile and said, "Oh, when the government tried to separate us from God and put us into death, which is the furthest away from the author of life, you know what we found in that moment? We found God in the flames." And the historian realized and felt all of the fear she had been holding on to. She thanked Mina, hugged her, and then walked out of that house without any fear in her heart, but only love. Amen.